a Bayan-M warship belonging to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, worth nearly $80 million, at Military Pier No. 2 in Temriuk Bay, an inland area considered by Moscow to be untouchable. More than 65 miles had just returned from a strategic Caliber strike mission, the cooling system, and especially reloading 8 Caliber NK cruise missiles, each worth over $1 million, of more than 950 miles, capable of reaching any city in Ukraine. A group of officers was gathered, raising vodka glasses to celebrate the recently completed mission. The combat crew was rotating rest shifts. Some had fallen asleep at control stations. No one knew that just over 6 miles away, a high-speed boat bearing civilian markings was silently outside. The speedboat looked like a regular fishing vessel, but inside the cockpit were 2 Ukrainian soldiers from the 73rd Naval Center, dressed in fishing jackets and Russian-style fisherman caps. Where there should have been styrofoam boxes filled with squid and herring, were 2 Beaver model FPV suicide drones, heavy configuration, equipped with 8-pound armor-piercing warheads, night vision cameras, and internal navigation systems. In less than 5 minutes, that small boat would become the mobile launch pad for one of the boldest naval attacks Ukraine had ever carried out. Right in the middle of a zone, Bayan-M warship is a compact but extremely dangerous war machine. Unlike massive ships that carry helicopters and heavy air defense systems, the Bayan-M is designed for narrow inland waters like the Caspian or Azov, but still capable of striking nearly any target. Leaves Temriuk port, considered the cocoon of Russia's Azov fleet. Cities like Kyiv, Lviv, or Odessa face new uncertainty. Grid, a fuel depot, or a kindergarten. Ukraine knew this well, and they decided not to wait for the next launch. They would strike first. The defense system around Temriuk port, where the warship was docked, was extremely dense. A Panzer S-1 system, specialized in intercepting UAVs and cruise missiles, 2 Podlet K-1 radar stations on active duty 24/7. This meant every layer of armor was active. Any unknown object that appeared would be shot down almost immediately. And so, the Russian Navy believed Temriuk Bay was a steel nest, where no UAV could get close. That was a fatal mistake, because Ukraine had calculated the exact timing and chosen a method the enemy wouldn't expect, skimming the sea surface, the radar blind zone, a gap so narrow it seemed harmless, with the weapon Russia least expected. A UAV costing just 1/500 of 3:27 a.m. when the boat was just 3 miles from the target, right on the outer edge of Temriuk port's surveillance ring. The 2 Ukrainian soldiers in the cockpit moved quickly, camouflage tarps covering the back compartment. From beneath, 2 FPV drones emerged. Each drone was about 4 feet long, with a wingspan of 5.5 feet. The body made of fiberglass composite, ultralight, low thermal signature, matte gray to blend in with the sea. As soon as everything was ready, the 2 soldiers pulled the safety pins, activated the internal navigation modules, and pressed arm and release. UAVs were deployed using an independent dual strike model, 2 approach vectors, 2 separate targets, fully synchronized in time and tactics. Codenamed Hrom, Thunder, controlled by the primary group, was programmed to fly directly toward the surveillance radar tower to disable the main radar system, temporarily blinding the Russian warship. The second, codenamed Vidplata, Retribution, operated by HUR Special Operations Forces, would follow from a 30-degree offset on the right flank and strike the Kaliber missile launcher amidships, which held all 8 Kaliber NK cruise missiles. If Hrom succeeded in blinding the radar, Vidplata would have the chance to pierce the final armor layer and strike at the heart of the warship, where not only the missiles were stored, but also the fire control command center. Minutes and 12 seconds a.m., the first UAV was pushed off the launch rail at the stern of the boat. In just 3 seconds, the high-speed electric propeller activated, the UAV accelerated, and took off, flying just above the water's surface. The second drone followed 40 seconds later. Both UAVs flew approximately 200 feet apart, at an altitude of no more than 7 feet, low enough to slip beneath the scanning angles of the Podlet and Pantsir radars. From that moment on, the boat had completed its mission. Everything that followed was entirely in the hands of two unmanned killing machines, guided by internal navigation algorithms, inertial sensors, and inside a control bunker near the city of Zaporizhzhia. A UAV operator from the primary unit, everything around him was dead silent. Only the dim glow of the monitor illuminated his tense, motionless face. The radar tower loomed on the screen, a near-perfect target. The operator held his breath. The ROM drone was closing in, just a few hundred feet to go. The distance readout showed 950 feet, then 800, then 650. Still no reaction from the Russian vessel. Its radar kept rotating, unaware of the incoming threat. The operator tightened his grip on the control stick. The countdown began. 5 seconds. 4. 3. In that instant, everything went still. At exactly 3:31 minutes and 25 seconds a.m., a bright flash erupted directly on the main radar mast, followed by a white plume slicing across the deck. Flames burst out on both sides like massive welding torches. Shrapnel scattered, splashing into the sea like fireworks. Just 0.7 seconds after ROM struck, the entire surveillance and navigation system of the Bayan-M simultaneously shut down. The main antenna was ripped from its rotation shaft and flung across the deck. Transmitter shorted out, sending sparks into the equipment. The explosion's heat singed auxiliary sensor clusters. The central data processor, shielded once a powerful long-range strike platform, was now in a state of temporary tactical blindness. The ship's commander immediately gave the order, run a fast diagnostic on the sensors, possible electronic warfare attack, but the responses were hopeless. Main radar, Bayan-M now had only one hope of survival. The Pantsir S-1 close-in defense system with an engagement range of 2.5 to 3.5. It had to be activated manually by the crew. However, after ROM's strike, the control center had been destroyed and cabin temperatures surged, making it impossible to trigger the support defense system. The composite shell on the command tower was ripped open, allowing sea wind and carbon dust from the blast to pour in. A radar officer was critically injured. A shard from the antenna penetrated the observation window and struck his left chest. Within less than 10 seconds, the entire defense crew was thrown into chaos, losing command capability temporarily. And this still wasn't the end. Now the real threat arrived from an angle no one anticipated. At 3:31 minutes and 25 seconds a.m., just 6 seconds after the first strike. From the port side, a small gray object skimmed the surface at nearly 95 miles per hour, heading directly for the Caliber launcher section amidships. Vidplata's target was the center deck, where the 3 S-14 vertical launch system was located, housing up to 8 Caliber NK cruise missiles. In the auxiliary control room, a watch officer shouted, "Low-level object approaching, port side," but it was already too late. The optical camera was obscured by burned dust. The Pantsir battery had not been ordered to fire. The command crew was still trying to reboot the system. The Bayan-M was now completely exposed to the second strike. The FPV feed from Vidplata captured every launch bay clearly. Rectangular hatches painted in matte grayish-green, protruding from the deck like flat horizontal chimneys, arranged in parallel rows along the ship's center line, exposing part of a Caliber NK already in pre-launch mode. Plata that had been programmed to hit. It immediately veered in from the port side, approaching at a 25-degree angle relative to the ship's longitudinal axis. Exactly 3:32 a.m. Vidplata slammed straight into Launch Bay 3. Full explosion blew the hatch clean off. A thick column of black smoke shot dozens of feet into the air. The blast tore apart part of the center deck. Steel plating bent. Metal fragments scattered like shrapnel. Immediately after impact, the ship's internal fire suppression system activated. Carbon dioxide valves popped open along the deck. Compressed gas was sprayed in bursts to extinguish flames and reduce heat. The launch control module was incinerated. The two adjacent launch bays overheated rapidly. The risk of a secondary explosion couldn't be ruled out. And after the blast, the vessel began tilting 3 to 5 degrees to the right, a clear sign of internal imbalance or a flooded technical compartment. Crew members rushed to inspect the deck. Emergency valves were sealed. the entire defense system was switched to manual mode. The ship did not sink, but at this point, it had lost all defensive and offensive capability. The UHF-banned internal military communications channel of the Black Sea Fleet B-38 attacked, radar damaged, caliber system damaged, requesting support and tow back to Temriuk. Less than 7 minutes after the dual strike, the Bayan M had completely lost its combat capability and was forced to withdraw from its active post in Temriuk Bay. The Bayan M serves as Russia's main strike platform in the Sea of Azov. Bayan M can operate effectively, evading enemy radar while launching long-range cruise missiles. And now, at least one has been knocked out of the fight. Just hours after the attack, Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate released UAV footage clearly showing the first strike hit the radar, destroying the top of the mast. Seconds later, a second drone slammed into the center deck. Flames erupted, the ship tilted noticeably. No air defense response was observed. Trusted outlets such as Naval News, Kyiv Post, Business Insider, and the Kyiv Independent all confirmed the video's authenticity. According to independent naval experts, the FPV drone attack on the Bayan M warship not only caused direct material damage, but also had immediate strategic consequences across the Sea of Azov. After the attack, the Bayan M was forced to return to its naval base in Sevastopol for assessment and repairs, on the extent of the damage and the recoverability of its digital infrastructure. For Ukraine, this was a clean tactical victory, achieved at less than 1% the cost of the target, yet with an impact that could shift the balance of power for days or even weeks. Dealt a blow to the confidence Russia's navy once had in the supposed safe zone of the Azov interior, and prepare caliber strikes without fear of pursuit. But reality has just proven the opposite. 2 FPV drones, launched from a disguised speedboat, not only penetrated a multi-million-dollar air defense system, but struck the 2 most critical vulnerabilities of a warship: its radar and missile launch system. And this wasn't the first time a Russian warship had been hit by improvised drones. Back in late 2024, Ukrainian special forces used improvised UAVs to disable a Sergei Kotov-class patrol boat off the Crimean coast, forcing it to remain docked for repairs. That same year, a Cesar Kunikov-class landing ship was completely sunk during a drone-based amphibious strike. More recently, in July 2025, as a radar station, a move Western analysts described as a turning point in asymmetric warfare. These are no longer desperate ramming attacks, but well-executed operations, with planning, rehearsal, and synchronized timing, using small, inexpensive weapons that know how to exploit blind spots. Individual UAV deals a fatal blow. Rather, it's the intelligent, coordinated, and unconventional use of them these drones into the Russian Navy's strategic nightmare of the 21st century. From this point forward, any Russian vessel operating in the area, whether it's a Bayan M, a Cerna class, or a logistics ship, must now face the ever-present threat of UAVs.
At 12:25 a.m., at the Primorsk oil port on the Baltic coast, millions of barrels of oil. An unprecedented anomaly appeared on the screen of a Nebo M long-range VHF radar station to the south. Exactly more than 70 unidentified signals with low radar cross-sections were heading toward Russian airspace. The source of these signals extended up to 1,000 kilometers, and their potential payload totaled over 3 tons of high explosives. At the Leningrad Oblast Air Defense Command Center, sirens began to wail when the data was confirmed by the 91. Foundations for this operation were laid months earlier in a planning room in Kiev. However, the 1,000-kilometer range was a problem in itself, known even by NATO standards as an anti-access area denial A2/AD bubble, which was deployed along this entire range. Russian generals were calm. This was precisely the moment their systems were designed for. Russia's 3-layered, integrated air defense network kicked in flawlessly. The 92N6E gravestone engagement radars of the S-400 batteries around St. Petersburg began locking onto targets one by one. At lower altitudes, Pantsir S-1 batteries met approaching targets with a wall of steel, unleashing the hellish fire of twin 2A38M 30mm cannons capable of firing 5,000 rounds per minute into the sky. However, the chaos the Russians was a massive, geographically precise deception plan. To draw the Russian defense umbrella away from waves of decoys were specifically directed at the villages of Sevolosk, Tosno, Pokrovskoye, and Uzmino, as well as the Lomonosov district in Leningrad Oblast. At the same time, the districts of Volosovsky, Tosnensky, Gachinsky, Lomonosovsky, and Pushkinsky in St. Petersburg were also targeted, completely drawing the attention of the most powerful S-400 batteries. In an air defense shelter in Gachinsky, a young Russian lieutenant, seeing the last target in his sector disappear from his screen, passed his routine report to the command center. "Sector clear, all targets destroyed." This report, as it climbed up the chain of command, led the generals to the biggest mistake of their careers. What they thought was victory was actually a trap. For this complex plan, more than 70 drones were assigned to the Leningrad and St. Petersburg region. Of these, 35 AQ-400 Scythes were tasked with luring St. Petersburg. The remaining 40 drones formed the main force that would spread across the Leningrad Oblast. Success of the plan depended on some of the 40 drones heading for Leningrad overcoming this hellish wall of fire and reaching their target. The adequacy of every element was critical for the technical implementation of this plan. The UJ-26 Bober ER drones that made up the assassination squad were specially selected for this mission. The range of standard Bober drones was insufficient for this mission. The ER, extended range, versions, however, were the only kamikaze platforms in the Ukrainian inventory capable of completing a 1,000-kilometer one-way flight. With a similar solution was developed for the electronic warfare. Standard EW drones was insufficient to accompany the assassination squad along the route. Therefore, the Banshee 7 platforms were also built on the same long-range body as the Bober ER, carrying advanced jamming pods and additional antennas instead of explosive payloads. Their mission was to escort the Bober drones to the target, i.e. for 1,000 kilometers. The reason for choosing the AQ-400 Scythe as bait was its simplicity. Its plywood body not only provided a low radar signature, but also facilitated mass production. Hundreds of drones needed for a saturation attack could thus be produced quickly and cheaply. At midnight, more than 70 drones took off from different points in Ukraine and began infiltrating Russia at low altitude. The first few hours passed in absolute radio silence, tracking the terrain. Using digital terrain maps, the drones followed riverbeds and forested areas, staying below the coverage range of the main Russian radar networks. This was a major test for each drone's autonomous navigation systems. Several drones were lost during this challenging flight, either crashing into the terrain or suffering technical failures, casualty from the outset of the plan. Once they crossed the Russian border, the rules of the game changed. They no longer had to hide, they had to manage. When the Russian air defense network woke up, it reacted exactly as Ukraine had expected. When the 91 N6E Big Bird radars detected this massive but scattered swarm coming from hundreds of kilometers away, the system automatically prioritized the cluster it perceived as the greatest threat, the 35 Scythes heading for St. Petersburg. The massive 48 N6 series missiles, launched from S-400 launchers, hunted down these cheap plywood targets one by one. For the Russians, this was flawless defense. Meanwhile, for the other 40 drones scattered across the Leningrad Oblast countryside, began a deadly game of cat and mouse with the Pantsir and BUK systems. A Pantsir S-1 battery near Volosovsky locked onto a low-flying UJ-26 Bober. The Pantsir's 1RS-2-1E tracking radar had captured the target flawlessly. The Russian operator could see all the target's telemetry data on the fire control screen. The Ukrainian operator could also see the signal from that radar locked onto the Bober on his own screen. He remained calm because a nearby Banshee 7 had already made its countermove, detected the Pantsir's X-band frequency, and emitted such a powerful jamming signal on the same frequency the Russian operator's screen instantly went completely white. The lock was broken. As a last resort, the operator fired the two A-38M 30mm cannons, but Bober had already slipped through the barrage of fire and disappeared into the darkness. The Russians were stubborn, and their firepower was high. Towards the center of Leningrad, they managed to crash a total of 33 drones into the ground in a hail of fire and metal. All those heading toward because as that lieutenant passed his report, from the blind spot created by all this fire and noise, assassination squad consisting of only 7 specially modified UJ-26 Bober ER drones had breached the main line of defense. These 7 drones would soon plunge surgical scalpels, each carrying a 40-kilogram armor-piercing warhead, into the economic heart of Russia. The Russian generals were looking only at the corner of a huge canvas shown to them and were about to miss the whole picture. It was 4:45 a.m. The Primorsk port's own Pantsir battery was startled when 7 small signals appeared on its screen and rapidly approached, catching it off guard. In a panic, it opened fire. 6 missiles left the launchers, but the targets were too low, too fast, and too close. The 7 Bobr drones split into 2 groups, with a final maneuver over the port. 3 headed for the pumping station, the heart of the port. Missiles caught one of the trio in the air, just a few hundred meters from its target. But that was the Russians' last consolation that night. The remaining 2 Bobr drones dove to complete their mission. The first drone, carrying a TBG, all the oxygen in the enclosed space, creating a massive pressure wave that blew the building's walls outward. A few seconds later, the second drone dove into the main pipeline manifold. The explosion severed the port's lifelines. At the same time, the remaining 4 Bobr drones locked onto 2 tankers waiting at the pier. The second drone struck one of the main cargo tanks filled with oil, starting a massive fire. The other 2 Bobr drones targeted the Sergei Gorshkov. The strikes were nearly identical. One targeted the ship's engine room, the other the loading manifolds. 4 of the UAVs struck 2 Aframax-class tankers belonging to the Shadow Fleet, named Kusto and Kai-Yun. Kusto was a carrier vessel managed by Solstice Corp with a deadweight tonnage, DWT, of 115,000. Kai-Yun was another Aframax tanker, registered to Axaronix Limited and operating with a DWT of 110,000. Both were listed under suspicious flags in the international insurance market's maritime shipping registers line. And when the drones arrived, loading was about to be completed. For facade of the port's control center. With a short circuit, the entire port went into emergency shutdown mode. However, this shutdown command did not pass through the system because the core of the energy control system had also been hit. The 4th and 5th drones targeted the loading arms at the stern of the tankers. A fire broke out on the Kusto, and fuel began leaking from the Kai-Yun. The 6th and 7th drone attacks were in the area of the pump valves, and after these attacks, it was no longer possible to control the fire. Primorsk was evaporating. Within minutes, the port of Primorsk resembled hell, with 2 massive burning tankers and a devastated pumping station. Hours after the attacks had been shot down across the country overnight, and that all attacks had been successfully repelled. However, these figures were meaningless compared to satellite images from Primorsk showing billions of dollars in damage. The targets were not random. Primorsk alone accounted for approximately 20% of Russia's oil exports by sea. The targeted Aframax-class tankers, each with a capacity of approximately 700,000 barrels of oil, were key vessels in the Shadow Fleet used to circumvent sanctions. The port of Primorsk facilitated an annual oil export value of $15 billion. The oil in Primorsk is the gateway for barrel-based oil shipments that are difficult to track and even harder to control, sold to international shadow fleets. And closing this gateway directly affects Russia's war fund. The average daily shipment of 1 million barrels of oil, daily loss of approximately $70 to $80 million. At that time, St. Petersburg's Pulkovo Airport triggered its Cover Plan. 11 aircraft were diverted to alternative airports. That same morning, numerous UAVs entering the airspace simultaneously pushed civil-military air traffic management into crisis mode. When the safety reflex kicked in first from the radar and tower perspective, Leningrad Regional Administration and the airport operator was also passed on to Russian state agencies. A cluttered screen over St. Petersburg. UAV wreckage shot down in the Leningrad countryside, parts falling outside residential areas. All of this kept the operator's attention focused upward from the sea horizon, locked onto the terminal. From a technical standpoint, Ukraine's long-range UAV concept achieved 3 things in this mission. First, it did not allow for range calculation errors. As the UAVs were analyzed, it became clear that 2 different classes were used. Russian systems were optimized to stop a small number of high-tech targets. Ukraine's swarm tactic overwhelmed the system's decision-making targets and interference that Russian operators could no longer distinguish the real threat. Traces of such systems were found among the drone parts captured around St. Petersburg. The parts found in Uzmino and Pokrovskoye indicated that they were carriers equipped with navigation software. This meant that Ukraine had flown not only to strike, but also to deceive. Had made the struck point invisible. And this deception had made confirmation came when images of the fire spread on social media. The fire could not be brought under control. and the official statement that followed left no choice but to admit the attack. Moreover, on a morning when it was operating at full capacity. As mentioned, the Russian command failed to foresee the attack. Primorsk was thought to be such a deep, well-protected, and powerful port. Despite the presence of units such as the 6th Combined Arms Army in Leningrad, the 2nd Independent Motorized Division, and the Baltic Fleet headquarters in the region, there was a defensive weakness. These units were mainly in a defensive position facing west. In other words, they were looking outward, not inward. This was because the Russian officer corps did not expect this scenario. The naval base at Kronstadt, the artillery and rocket units on the Lugal on the Gachina-Pushkin-Agalatovo line. This entire network had been operating under a regular threat model for 3 years, with processes functioning according to a southeast central Russia pattern. Close the port on the Baltic coast was considered unlikely. Simultaneous inflation of the coastal sea bands produced small delays. Together, a decisive window of opportunity for infiltration emerged around the terminal. The real surprise was the expectation that the Russian officers would not be the main focus, but rather the surrounding axes. Surroundings only clouded the scene, while the strike hit the target squarely. In other words, the Ukrainian armed forces succeeded by gathering the right intelligence and choosing the right time frame. The attack came from outside and penetrated inside, and inside, it burned everything. On paper, Russia's defense umbrella in the region is strong, but in practice, when combined with low-altitude/sea horizon and synchronized false target clutter, it can produce misses in short windows. This was the case on the morning of September 12th, but the configuration was not enough to prevent low-profile drones from infiltrating the terminal. Flying low, skimming the sea horizon, entering the line of sight of fixed antennas only in the final moments, this geometry forces even upper-tier systems like the S-400 into a race against the clock. By the time your radar spots the target, it is almost upon you. And if the calculation is delayed, the fact that the Bober flew at low altitude meant that, due to the curvature of the Earth, even the most powerful 91N6E Big Bird radars could only detect them at the last stage, for a very short time. This short window was not enough for effective interception. Temporary closure decisions and district-by-district siren cycles in Pulkovo, in the skies over St. Petersburg.